you're kind of like engaging in this shared history of like all men for thousands and thousands of years of history. Like this is how we've kind of always
And did
done
they
it.
not compete naked a lot of the time when they're grappling and fighting?
Yeah.
That's primal, man. Just like there's positions
Totally.
in jiu-jitsu where your balls are literally on the guy's head, and I can't even imagine if there was no fabric to separate.
What's the most efficient path to victory against this particular opponent?
He's dropping off for the choke here. We could see the finish. It's looking tight. Tight at Alpra.
Hey guys, welcome to the Essential Jiu-Jitsu Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Kwan. The Essential Jiu-Jitsu Podcast is everything you need to know about jiu-jitsu. Today I have a very special guest, the host of How to Take Over the World podcast, Mr. Ben Wilson. Welcome to the show, Ben.
Thanks, Matt.
Thank you for coming. I've been listening to your show now probably for about 6 months. It's called How to Take Over the World, and it basically is a podcast that follows historical figures and great men and women throughout history. And I don't mean great as in like morally good necessarily, but just like influential people. Some of these people are downright genocidal, but just like influential historical figures. Anyone who knows me knows that I'm a huge fan of history, and I was introduced to your show about 6 months ago, maybe a little bit more, and instantly I was hooked. I just went on a podcast binge of How to Take Over the World. Really, really great stuff. Why don't you just introduce yourself first and let us know who you are?
Well, I actually, so I grew up in California, and I started my career in management consulting, and then ended up going into tech a little bit and doing marketing in tech. And then just for fun, I started this podcast because I was reading a biography of Napoleon, and I thought, I just got so energized from this biography. I was like, oh, I wish I could retain more of what I'm feeling, what I'm learning right now. So I thought I'll start something. And so I was thinking, is it going to be a blog? Is it going to be a podcast? And I had all this old equipment sitting around that someone had given me, an old radio guy who was retiring. He said, you have a great voice. You have a voice of gold.
You do have a good voice.
Take some of my old, thanks. And he was retiring. So he said, why don't you take this? So I had this sitting around. So I was like, all right, I'll start a podcast. And so that's how to Take Over the World started. And then over time, it's gotten to the point where I've been able to offload everything else, and this has become my career. Thankfully, the show's done well.
So just to be clear, you are not a historian.
No, and I never try and pose as such, but I think, I think I know history well enough to be able to. My approach to it is, I'm going to tell you everything that is unobjectionable, that everyone agrees on. And then where there are places where there's something unknown or controversy, I'm just going to point it out, and I'm going to skip over that for the most part. Because what I'm trying to do is not get every historical detail for you so that you know every historical fact about Napoleon. I'm trying to help people learn from his life so that it can help improve their life. And usually the little details that people, that historians kind of disagree over, are not super relevant to the takeaways.
Mm-hmm. And so would you say Napoleon was kind of your inspiration to start this show, which was a passion project, essentially?
Yeah, he was the first one. I got really excited about his biography. He's just lived such a compelling life, This is someone who really got started when he's in his 22, I think is how old he is, when he has his first major victory at Toulon. And then it's just kind of action-packed for the next 20 years until his second abdication. So, that was the one that set me off. Interestingly, I don't really view myself as a Napoleonic type figure. I just don't have a lot of the same attributes that he does, but I found a lot of inspiration from him regardless.
So me and my wife went to Whistler the other weekend, and on the way up, I was like, hey, here's a podcast I really like. It's called How to Take Over the World. We should try it. And she's like, sure. She listens to certain podcasts or whatever. And then I, not usually history ones though. Right. And then we put on your series on Walt Disney, and she was like, whoa, this guy's voice is great. The delivery's great. And then right away, as soon as part one ended, she wanted to listen to part two. And I'm like, yeah, this is good shit. Right. It's funny you talk about Napoleon, because I listened to your Napoleon episodes and they're awesome. And the main thing that I took from it, especially in the end notes, is like you said, that energy that he had when he was accomplishing his goals. And also you talk about like, oh, these were the attributes that made him a really great leader. This is how he this was like his daily routine. This is how he got things done and was so productive. And here are some main takeaways. So I really like how your show, a lot of the time you relate to these figures in history, and then you take away their qualities and their traits and say, hey, we can apply these in life. As your show title is, How to Take Over the World, how to be more successful, how to be more productive in life. And just to finish off my note on Napoleon, I actually just listened to your show notes episode on Napoleon where you discussed the movie review, and it sounds like you weren't really too happy with how Joaquin Phoenix portrayed Napoleon. You kind of fell flat and was kind of like an inverted depiction of your through your study, your perception of what Napoleon actually was.
Yeah, I was really disappointed by that. I really think, I like Napoleon, but there's a lot of room to not like Napoleon. Obviously I can easily understand people who fall on the other side of that divide. But if you're not going to like Napoleon, well, I guess just the depiction of Napoleon had nothing to do with him, right? If you're going to criticize Napoleon, it's going to be for his just endless ambition, right? For his overactivity, for his unwillingness to stop. And the movie portrayed exactly the opposite of someone who essentially just like kind of bumbles through life. I don't know. It was really disappointing for me to see it like that. And that's something I'm actually really passionate about. One of the reasons I wanted to do this is I do find a lot of inspiration from these stories, and people always have, right? If you go through history, I was just reading The Prince by Machiavelli, Niccolo Machiavelli, which is this famous book about from Florence during the Renaissance. And it's this guy writing, he's basically saying, if you're a ruler, this is how to rule. And he's looking through a bunch of historical examples. And it's kind of like an extended version of How to Take Over the World. And he says, when I come home from the day, I take off my outside clothes that are dirty and I put on my nicest robes. And I go and I sit down and I read the biographies of these famous people throughout history. And I wear my nicest clothes because I feel like I'm about to engage in a conversation with Alexander the Great, with Julius Caesar. And how would I want to dress for that conversation, right? And so I do think like there's this amazing ability to read these biographies, to learn from these people throughout history. Instead, what you see, there's not a lot of interest in those types of figures right now in like mainstream movies and TV, mainstream media for whatever reason. And I find that unfortunate. And so that's something I'm hoping to kind of bring to the fore again, is to give to people is interest in these people that I think we can just learn a ton from and be inspired by.
Mm-hmm. And Alexander the Great was actually the first episode that I listened to of yours. My buddy recommended it, and I was just like, wow, this is awesome. I think that's also a multi-part series. I think it's like got 2 episodes. Were you always interested in history? Like for me, I was naturally drawn to history. Like in fact, history class in high school was like my favorite class. I went right into culinary arts out of high school, but I very well could have, pursued a background in history because I really, really enjoyed it. It wasn't like work to me. It was really interesting. Specifically for me, the conflict that really drew me in was World War I, World War II. That was like something that just captivated me, right? Was there a conflict or, a period time that really hooked you and you were like, okay, like I really enjoy the study of history. I want to learn more about where we came from and historical figures?
For me, and I'm interested to hear from you what like that first experience was for me. For me, it was this book on knights and castles, and it had like all these diagrams and show you a castle and what they would do to the invaders and all these like trap doors and what they used for defenses, and knights would show you their different weapons and how you could use the different weapons. And so then I got very into Arthurian legend, King Arthur and his knights and all of that. So for me, it was very much like the Middle Ages, and knights was sort of my introduction to that as like a boy. That's what got me hooked. And it's funny that you mentioned conflict. I very much think for guys, it is like, and look at you now, you're a martial artist, right? So it's like not terribly surprising, but for boys, it's almost always some conflict. It's like the
It's
history of war.
combat.
That's what always draws us in. Yeah, it's combat, right? And there's something natural about that. So that's what it started with, was kind of the Middle Ages. Interestingly, like that isn't, now I'd say I'm more interested in the Napoleonic Wars is probably what I'm most drawn to now, and World War II.
I mean, it's funny, the type of book that you mentioned. I remember having a very similar book. It had different time periods and it followed different militaries. And of course, it had their different weapons and their different strategies, like you mentioned, like trapdoors and things like that. This book had all different types of periods. One of the periods was Middle Ages. It had like Persian army. It had these different armies, and it would show the armor they wore and things like that. Like I grew up playing a lot of like first person shooters, and just like a typical boy, like I loved combat. I loved weaponry, learning about military warfare and military history. Like really, doesn't really matter what period. It all interests me. And yes, naturally, I did gravitate towards martial arts, which is like in Jiu Jitsu, it's weaponless hand-to-hand fighting, but it's just kind of a fractal scale of actual combat. Like there's a lot of parallels between grappling and the same type of strategies that you would see two armies on the battlefield employ. Like asymmetrical warfare, creating disadvantages for the people you're trying to fight. Trying to dominate like an offensive cycle against the opposition, trying to force them into a cycle of defense where essentially they're starting to break mentally, and then that you wear them down over time, and then that's when you kind of take over. So it's fascinating for me. Just the more and more I study martial arts and I see the psychology and strategy behind martial arts, I also see that the same things being applied to armies on a large scale.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting how much the principles don't change. So, for example, if historians, one of the things that they have spent a lot of time trying to figure out is if you go back and look at like the sources for ancient Greek warfare or ancient Roman warfare, or even like basically all of warfare, no one really takes the time to sit down and say, this is how it happened. Right? They say like these people attacked this people and this division went here and then these people retreated. But no one, I guess it just seemed obvious to them like how the combat actually happened. So we don't know for sure, right? Of like, were they pushed up once against another and like actively engaged the entire time? Or was there a little bit of space between the armies? How tightly packed were they? Did they actually have a chance for like swordsmanship, or is it just all pushing and thrusting? There's all these questions about how the combat actually happened. And so historians have gone back and spent a lot of time trying to reconstruct, taking little pieces of details to try and say, okay, well, he says he's swinging a sword, which means they can't be shoulder to shoulder, right? They do all this stuff trying to reconstruct it. And what's interesting is like when you put some of this stuff together, you go and you look at like riot situations, and where you have like a police line and then rioters who will often kind of surge up and maybe do some pushing and shoving and then retreat back. And it very closely resembles like ancient Roman or Greek
like a phalanx.
Combat. Like a phalanx. Yeah, exactly. And you just realize, whoa, like human nature does not change at all. And even if you go look at like a bar fight, right? A lot of times people will sort of naturally drift into these combat positions that are very reminiscent of what you'd see in ancient warfare. So that was all to say, you're exactly correct. A lot of this stuff doesn't change. In fact, when we're talking about combat sports, if you go and you look at the Greeks, they competed over everything, right? They had foot races. They even like they were big into poetry and drama, right? And for them, everything was a competition. So it wasn't just poetry. They would have poetry competitions. People would read their poetry and they would rank them, give awards. But they had, they were big into boxing, they were big into wrestling, and they had something called pankration, which you
like
probably
MMA,
know,
basically.
Right? But
early MMA.
It's basically MMA, right? It's a combination of wrestling and boxing that actually, when you go and you look at the depictions of it, a lot of, not just the fact that it's a combination of wrestling and boxing, but a lot of like the positions, the grappling, the techniques are like so reminiscent of what you see in modern MMA that you're like, whoa, we basically were just rediscovering what they had figured out, which was the optimal way of fighting like 2,500 years ago, right? So it is like, it's really cool to think that when you're engaging in this, you're kind of like engaging in this shared history of like all men for thousands and thousands of years of history. Like this is how we've kind of always
And did
done
they
it.
not compete naked a lot of the time when they're grappling and fighting?
Yeah.
That's
They did.
primal, man. Just like there's positions in
Totally.
jiu-jitsu where your balls are literally on the guy's head, and I can't even imagine if there was no fabric to separate. Like, oh my god, this is even more
Right.
demoralizing. Or maybe for them it's totally fine. I know the Greeks were pretty they were pretty open about homosexuality and everything. Yeah, it's very interesting.
Kind of.
Another concept that we see over and over through military history and in MMA and in jiu-jitsu is the idea of how combat is an arms race. The army with the best weaponry or the newest weaponry that has the most effect tends to win these battles. First it probably was like sticks and stones and bladed objects. Then we got people riding on horseback and using arrows. And then all of a sudden, gunpowder comes on the scene, catapults, cannons. And then we fast forward, now we have machine guns. And then, of course, like even to a higher scale, like nuclear warheads and who knows what kind of weapons, rail guns and things we don't even know about now, which are just like terrifying weapons. Same goes for like jiu-jitsu and MMA. If you watch MMA through the 90s when it was first kind of big in the United States, it was very primitive and there were styles that it wasn't really MMA. There was a couple of guys that cross-trained in different arts, but it wasn't the sport that we see today. It was brawling, and it was like, okay, this jiu-jitsu guy is going to do his best to get the fight to the ground. The boxer is going to do his best to try and stay on the feet and knock you out. And then as time plays out, the sport evolves. Everyone starts to now have the same technology. And so what you see now is a hybrid mix where everyone basically needs to be maybe not a master of every aspect, but very high level at every aspect. And they need to be able to combine things to be effective in the arena. And I find the same thing applies on the battlefield throughout history between armies. Is if you are using bow and arrows and your opponent is using gunpowder, it's a mismatch. It turns into a slaughter. And then you see tactics change. You see guerrilla warfare. Instead of guys lining up in front of each other and just mowing each other down, you see people keep constantly finding new tactics and new ways to win. And I just find that so interesting how, again, that is like human nature, right? How do we always get that advantage over our opponent? How can we always exploit our opponent's weaknesses? So let me just ask you this, because you paint an amazing picture with how you depict battles and things like that. In your Genghis Khan series, you talk about how they would lure their opponents in and make them chase them. And then they would retreat, and they would retreat on horseback and then lure the following army into an ambush, essentially. You talk about Alexander the Great and phalanxes and things like this. And just, we don't have any footage of these battles, which, I'm not saying I want to see people die, but like just to see how the battle would play out would be incredible to witness. Even like battles in the trenches in World War I, like we have very limited, we do have some footage, but we don't have footage that kind of shows us a bird's eye view or gives us the whole perspective. So my question to you is, what battle would you pick? If you could watch any battle in history from a bird's eye view, like what would be the most interesting to you?
So that's interesting. So the first thing that comes to mind is the Battle of Austerlitz, which is a battle that Napoleon fought. I think to me, one of the reasons it's interesting, A, it's fought with these huge armies, right? And then B, it's this tactically brilliant battle where Napoleon essentially he weakens his right flank and lures his enemies to attack that flank. In the meanwhile, he puts some of his best troops in this kind of dip. And what happens is that they're covered by fog. And so the enemies don't know that they're there. And so right at the climactic, at the perfect moment of the battle, it's like, about midday, 11 a.m., about noon, and the sun burns off the fog. And then all of a sudden everyone can see them. And they're perfectly positioned to go take the strong central position of the Russians and Austrians and basically end the battle. That would be so cool. Having said that, I actually don't think that's my answer. And the reason is, you're talking about combat. There's something very primal about hand-to-hand combat that has been lost, unfortunately, right? Like, I would love to see something from the era of the warrior, like I would love to see two knights engaged in combat where you have this like beautiful display of chivalry and strength, or two hoplites, or something like that. So I do think I would love to see chivalric knights engaged in combat. So
it's a tough question, man, especially when there's so
Battle
many
of Tours, maybe
so many battles.
It would be interesting. Or Agincourt might be my answer.
Pre-gunpowder,
just because I would love
pre-gunpowder.
Yeah, pre-gunpowder, exactly. Yeah, I'll say Tours. That's a really interesting one that I would love to see.
Very cool. Do you think humans are just violent by nature?
Yes.
Do you think humans are inherently good?
No, certainly not. It depends. Depends what you mean by good. But I mean, I guess I am not someone who loves to talk in moral terms. Just because I think more often than not, it serves to obfuscate. It serves to like hide the truth more than it demonstrates it. So, for example, I was just reading, again, Machiavelli's The Prince, right? And he, the word Machiavellian has come to mean like sinister, conniving, and it's because he basically says stuff where he says, if you become the prince of a new state and you've overthrown a previous king, first action item, make sure that you kill all his family. Like, you don't want anyone who can come back and say, I'm the rightful king. So you got to kill all his family. And then you got the nobles to deal with. And some of them you can co-opt onto your side in certain circumstances. Otherwise, you need to kill all of them and all their family. Also, like, you should be willing to deceive. Anyways, in the middle of this, he's writing in the late 14, early 1500s. Very Christian time in Europe, right? And so if you're like a monk who's reading this, you're probably your jaw's on the floor. And he just has a chapter where he says, look, I'm just here to tell you the truth. And if you want to be a good person and not deceive anyone and not hurt anyone, like, that's fine. You have no business being anywhere near power, because you're just not going to be able to hold power. Like, that's just not the way the world works. And I really just try and take that sort of attitude in most things. Of most of the time, I just want to tell you how it is. And you can think about if that's comfortable or uncomfortable or right or wrong. But so much of the time when we talk about what's right or wrong, it allows us to just kind of gloss over how things really are, which I think is the first thing that you really need to establish.
Why do you think we're violent? Throughout history, combat sports, constant war, even like genocide, like medieval torture tactics that I've stayed up till 2 a.m. looking at because it's so fascinating and so appalling, but yet so fascinating that we're capable of like the most painful inflictions upon our fellow man. Like, why do you think we are so prone to violence, and why do we keep repeating that over and over again?
Well, there's a few answers. The more boring one is that it's an arms race, right? Like it's just so difficult to get everyone to say we're not going to be violent at the same time, and um, we're genetically coded for it, and so that's what happens. The other answer, the more interesting one, though, I think, is that violence is beautiful. Like if you look at the most beautiful art of all time, more often than not, it depicts violence. Like there is, what is the most beautiful animal? There like few things that are more beautiful than like just a male lion, full mane, and it's that latent violence within himself.
Mm.
You go look at some like the David, right? That's not an inherently violent statue. And yet it is. I think that's the reason that he is beautiful is you see these sinews and these muscles. He's holding a bow. Like he's clearly a man that is primed for violence. And so on the one hand, like, yes, you look at genocide, you look at a lot of the negatives that come with it. And of course, there's things that I wish I could do away with that are horrible. But at the same time, I think a world without violence would be an uglier world. And I wouldn't want to live in a world that was completely devoid of violence.
Mm-hmm. Do you enjoy or watch combat sports?
Yeah, I'm not like a super dedicated fan, but I like MMA. I like boxing.
Nice. What about jiu-jitsu? What about two dudes grappling on the floor?
Well, obviously, there's a lot of jiu-jitsu in MMA these days, but I have not watched a whole lot of like jiu-jitsu specific competitions or anything like that.
Yeah, I think to the untrained eye, jiu-jitsu can look quite ridiculous, especially a lot of the time two dudes just sit down. Like you're able to just like take the bottom position, and then it's kind of like an agreed term. Like, okay, I'll be on the bottom, you be on the top, which is not really how MMA works. MMA is more like neither wants to be on the bottom. If you're on the bottom, you're almost you are in MMA at an inherent disadvantage. So jiu-jitsu can look kind of interesting in that way and kind of goofy, but there is now jiu-jitsu is actually moving more towards a wrestling hybrid of jiu-jitsu in an organization called ADCC, and it's much more like a fight for the top position. It favors wrestling more. It favors the top position. So that I would say is more of a clear representation of an actual fight, and maybe even more spectator friendly from an actual conflict situation. You're a man of faith, are you not?
I am. Yeah, I'm LDS. What people commonly know as Mormon.
Okay. I actually came from I'm Canadian. A lot of Canadians are atheists. There's a lot of people up here, and I know in the States, who are atheists. I was raised in a family of people who are atheist. So I don't know. It was almost like it's weird. Almost people around me, it's kind of fashionable to even like kind of make fun of people who have religious faith. And I never thought too much of it when I was a kid. But when I had two children, I started thinking more about the role of religion in society and why someone would believe in God and what positives can that bring to someone's life. And I realized, I was like, man, there's a lot of people who are not only are they not religious, but it's almost like they're kind of anti-religious, and they're proud of it, and I realized, I'm like, this is kind of fascinating for me, because nobody ever forced me to go to church or anything like that, or have any religious traditions. And now I'm seeing things slightly different now that I have children. My question to you, what is the role of religion in societies, or today's society?
Well, the role of religion in today's society is almost nothing. Even, here in the US, where people think of us as a more religious Western country, especially reading about the Middle Ages, you realize, oh, this is how people would act if they really, really believed in the basic tenets of Christianity. And it just causes you to go, oh, like even religious people today don't burn with that same fire, right? There's a really good quote, let me see if I can remember it, about Rasputin and how he kind of came to power in Russia. where what did he say? We've all started to. But he basically says like the passion doesn't burn within us anymore. And then this burning torch comes onto the scene and lights everyone on fire, and that's why people followed Rasputin. That's why he became so powerful in Russia. I think that one of the most important, religion, people talk about it provides stability. It does. It provides a moral framework. It does. It provides a shared understanding of each other and of the world and have how people are supposed to interact with one another. That's all true. But it's also supposed to give people direction. It's supposed to tell them what is important and what is beautiful and what to pursue in life. And so, you look at sort of the ultimate religious expression of the Middle Ages, and that is cathedrals, right? Or during the same time in the Islamic world, these big, beautiful mosques, right? And there are these incredible churches. If you go and you go back further, you can, of course, look at things like Temple of Artemis, Temple of Zeus in terms of buildings, but also like, even Greek literature and Greek warfare was an expression of the old gods of their sort of polytheistic way of life. And I think right now, the goal of all religion needs to be to come up with something that sets men's hearts on fire. Because right now, religion is not doing that. And you can try and scold people into being religious, saying, oh, you need it, you should do it, it's good for you. And that's just never going to work. That's not attractive. I don't want that kind of religion. But if we can recapture a religious understanding that is beautiful and worth pursuing, and that is the kind of thing that will hopefully drive men towards greater heights, which is what I hope for.
Do you think that through history, man has kind of taken the idea of God and religion and sort of, tried to use it for, how's the word I should say? How should I say this? Trying to take advantage of people's belief in God and fear of God, and trying to like really just make money off of it and make it a way, where they kind of, it becomes less about the purpose of what religion is and more just about like financial gain and greed and a way to get power, a way to gain influence, rather than just, like you say, like the good, beautiful things, direction, love, the things that I believe people can really benefit through having like a relationship with God. Like, do you think that man takes advantage of that throughout history in a way that's maybe not the way that it should be?
Actually, no. I think that less than the average person. There's this good quote by Upton Sinclair, which is that it's difficult to get a man to understand something when his paycheck depends on him not understanding it, right? And so I think that it's actually, you can profit from something. Actually, if you profit from something, you're more likely to be a sincere believer, if that makes sense. So you can look at modern religions, and I consider certainly some of this more progressive stuff to be religious in nature. And if you go and you look at when people are criticizing a lot of these organizations, like very woke organizations, they'll say like, no, this is just hypocritical. Look how much money they're making from this. It's like, actually, if they're making a lot of money from it, they have even more incentive to be a genuine believer. And so I think that's the case, that like some of the people who are making the most money are like genuine believers. And I think that's true. Like, you go and you look at Catholic priests who were giving indulgences and lining their pockets, and they believed because of course they did. Like, it was good business to believe. So anyways, has religion been used for other purposes? Like, has it been used as a tool of power? Yes. Everything. That's how humans operate. everything is used as a tool of power. Money is used as a tool of power. Relationships, family, violence, states, like everything is used as a tool of power, including religion for sure. But I think as you go throughout history, most people are mostly sincere about what they believe.
Mm-hmm. And just to piggyback off of like the roles of religion in society, one thing you didn't mention is community. A lot of people, you know, back in the day before the times of even television and social media and things like this, when we weren't as connected worldwide, I think the church community had a bit more of a solidified role wherever you lived, because that was kind of your people, right? Like you would go and you would meet and you'd have relationships with these people in your community. Whereas now I think that's not as necessary to the average person, because our community might be on Facebook, right? You think you have a group of friends, but maybe you don't even see these people. You just have like a common interest. And so you're in this group. Like for me, I look at Jiu Jitsu, and my community within Jiu Jitsu is kind of my church in a way. I don't go to church and I don't identify as religious in any particular way. But I am now more open to the idea of there being a creator and whatnot. And I look at Jiu Jitsu as kind of my congregation. It's kind of my group of people where we all are on the same page there. A lot of us are like-minded, and that's kind of where we can like lean on each other and to support each other. And so I feel like with just this mass communication, on an international level, now less people they feel the necessity for religion, because it's being, their community needs are being filled with something else. It's just like, I think that a lot of people have they don't believe in God, or even they're kind of anti-God in ways. They think it's fashionable to not believe in God, but I feel like they still yearn for that role of God in their life. And so they use something else to fulfill that role. Maybe it's celebrities, maybe it's politicians, maybe it's their favorite show, or even their favorite sports team. There's still that yearning for like, oh, like this is something that I'm dedicating myself to. This is something that I believe in. This is my religion. Maybe for some people it's the almighty dollar, right? And I feel like just humans in nature inherently have those desires to have community and to believe in a higher power.
You left out one of the biggest one, which is politics. There's someone tweeted the other day, which I really liked. They said politics is just the religion that you actually believe in, and I think that's true for a lot of people. Politics plays that role in their life.
So you mentioned like woke culture, right? Just so you know, like I don't know, like we've just started talking, so you don't know like previously any opinions that I have or anything, but like I'm not afraid to talk about anything. I think we can agree that like most people who are woke or very progressive are usually, and I'm painting a picture with a broad brush here, but like usually they're atheistic. They're not people of faith, like the really hyper progressive, like far left. How do you feel about that type of culture as we progress? You know, the last 10 years, it was very, very, you weren't allowed to say certain things. And I feel like the veil is kind of getting lifted on that. Now you can speak out about certain topics that maybe before would get you straight up fired, you know, whether it's going to be like about Trump or about, things like Black Lives Matter, things like that. How do you feel that woke culture, how does it affect our society today? Whether it's positive, negative, what's your opinion?
I think it's almost unbelievably negative. I think that it's just so stultifying. It's so stifling.
Stifling what?
And
in what way?
So there are kind of two answers, because when people talk about woke, there's sort of what I would call deep woke, and then there's new woke. Deep woke is like the stuff that goes back 60 years or more, right? So you look at it and there's almost no, and you're into combat sports, which is good because that's one of the few places where you have male dominated spaces where like men can really come together and connect as men. And actually you look at it, and here in the United States, basically all men's organizations got sued out of existence starting in the 80s and going through the 90s, right? So you had a millionaire who died in California and left all of his money he said, I want to build like a boys' gymnasium in California. I think it'll be good for boys from the community. And basically there was a lawsuit and they said, yeah, that's not legal. And so they just took his money. Like, he died. It was an inheritance that he left to the state of California to build this thing. And they just took his money and just taxed it and said, no, that doesn't get to get built. And so that's like deep woke, like stuff that people don't think of as woke, but kind of goes back like 60 years. I think that's like one of the most destructive things. Is one of the ways that men can take ownership of their lives is through men's organizations. Like, we are a tribal species. We are not designed really to make an impact alone. You know, you look at all the people I profiled on my podcast, none of them did it alone. All of them were leaders of companies, of organizations. And okay, so what's the problem if you have an organization that has women in it? Like, of course, nothing, right? But for accomplishing things, it's great to have women in your organization. They're very capable. But for like that, like deep belonging, there's something about you. You at least need something in your life where you can really connect with other men, and that's difficult to do with other women present because it just creates like, as soon as a woman enters the picture, there's like competition, right? And so there's something special and different that happens when it's men only. I think the inverse is also probably true. There's something that happens for women in women's only settings. And so all of us need that in our lives. And so I think that is one of the most pernicious effects of sort of out of control liberalism. And then, you know, what I would say for like kind of new woke of this like sort of hyper crazy stuff that's been happening over
like
the last
science
5 to 10
doesn't
years.
exist. Men can be women. Women
Yeah,
can be
like,
men. We should be.
Math is racist.
Yeah, we should teach kids that being, you know, to be gay when they're like 5 or 6, that they should question their gender. These things like this. I got kids, right? Like, it was just as I was having kids, these things were starting to really become really talked about, and I thought it was nonsense before, but then as soon as I had kids, I realized, I'm like, fuck, my kids are going to come up in a school system where they're going to be talking about these ideas with them. And, you know, my daughter in kindergarten, when I went in to walk her into her first day, I saw signs all over the walls like, hey, it's okay if you're homosexual, transgender, blah, blah, blah. This is okay. This is a safe space. And I'm like, this reminds me of almost like communist, Marxist rhetoric. It almost reminds me of the Mao's China, where it was all about politically correctness, and like it was this is how you have to think. If you don't think this way, then it's wrong think. We need to have groupthink. We need everyone to be on the same page here. And it was setting a tone between me and my daughter where like, obviously she's oblivious to all this because kids who are 5 are not sexual, nor should they be thinking about sexuality at that age. They shouldn't be thinking about, am I a boy or a girl? These are very dangerous topics for such a young, impressionable mind. And this sign that these kids can't even read yet is spouting this agenda, and it's saying, hey, this is a safe space for these things. It even said like you can be pansexual, bisexual, and I'm thinking like, which one of these kindergarten students is sexual? Why would we assume that they even have sexuality at that age? Now we're introducing ideas, and we're also saying, hey, you know, little Billy or whatever, if this is a safe space. So if your dad doesn't want you being transgender, and he's telling you, no, like, don't question your gender. You're very young. Like, where'd you get this idea from? And then they go to school. School's like, hey, we'll accept you. This is a place, a safe space. So now the sign, or the state, is creating a divide between the family and the student, or the child. And it's saying, hey, Billy, your father is telling you that these ideas are not appropriate for you, but here, when you're within these walls, this is safe. You can be those things here, even though you can't be there. So now it kind of reminds me of like Marxist indoctrination, where one of the main strategies was to separate the children from the parents, so that you indoctrinate them at an extremely young age. And once you do that, once your child looks at the parents and thinks like, oh, like, actually you're my enemy, the state is my actual parents, that's when things get really, really dangerous. Now you've indoctrinated like the next generation before they have a chance to even reach puberty. And that's where things get really, really scary. And I think you have kids too, right?
I have three kids.
Three kids. Yeah. Awesome. So like, yeah, public school nowadays is kind of scary, the way that this is, the way that things are moving.
I mean, I think what you're trying to express is just the inability to just live ever, right? Like, you can't just naturally express yourself and say the things that you notice and that you think and that you feel, but like the need to pass everything through this filter of like, is this okay to say, just creates this experience where you never feel totally at home. Like, I remember talking with this coworker, and it's so funny because like every new person you meet, you kind of have to like feel it out a little bit,
Yeah.
you know? And so I'm talking to this coworker, and he mentions like, yeah, I'm Egyptian, I'm Muslim, I have 3 kids. And what was so funny was like, I immediately felt relaxed because I was like, all right, a guy who's Muslim, who goes to church, who has 3 kids, is not woke. And so like,
you have more in common with that person.
Exactly. 60 years ago, that actually would have represented like a barrier in a way, because, or not necessarily a barrier, but just like, oh, okay, then there are, you know, I'm not Muslim, I'm Christian, I'm LDS, and I'm American. He's American too, but like, whatever. I'm Anglo-American, you're Egyptian American. There are probably some different cultural, religious understandings that we'll have to work through. Now it's like, yo, those are so minor compared to the just like overwhelming totalitarian fear and loathing and hatred that comes with being wokeness, that anytime you meet someone who's just like, yeah, I don't do that, you're just like, oh, I feel great. We can just talk now. It's such a relieving feeling. And just imagine what it was like to never have to feel that, right? In no public setting. So anyways, hopefully we can at one point return to a time when no one has to think about that ever at any point.
So my next question, I'm pretty sure I know the answer. Do you believe we're in a societal decline?
Yes, we're definitely in a societal decline. I will say, declining societies, I mean, just look at the Roman Empire, can decline for a really long time. So I would tell people, don't bet on the United States of America ending anytime soon. Don't make any life plans based on that. But yeah, we're very obviously in decline.
Mm-hmm. What do you think? First of all, do you think it's possible to reverse that? Usually, if you look at empires in the past, because let's face it, we're a part of the American empire. Even in Canada, we are basically piggybacking off of your guys' military and your guys' influence and whatever. In history, we haven't really seen declining empires kind of turn the tide and prevent that decline. It's always progressively gone further and further. You know, a lot of the times things like the dollar becomes worthless. People start hating men. People start hating God. People start sexualizing children, things like that. And then you see an inevitable collapse. Like you said, it could take 100 years, could take 50 years, could take 200 years, whatever. Is there a way to kind of change the tide and go become more of a, I don't know if even moral is the word, but just stop this decline that we are on right now in society? And how would we do that?
So there are kind of two answers. So a society has a natural life cycle, right? Which is to be born and to grow and to mature. And it's in that, in that phase of adolescence that there's just like this explosion of energy and of youth. And then you have kind of the middle age where there's just a lot of productive things being accomplished. And then you go into old age and senescence. And so you, as a civilization, can stop aging so hard, but you never stop aging, if that makes sense. So you look at, for example, Rome is the example that everyone uses, right? Before Julius Caesar, it was essentially in a death spiral. You had these two competing factions, the Optimates and the Populares, and you're just spiraling into larger and larger international, intranational civil wars where you're purging people, you're committing murders, and it's getting worse and worse. And then Julius Caesar says, hey, I win, no more factions, and he stabilizes the situation. And so if you're thinking of it in terms of like civilizational life cycle, you're like, okay, this is a civilization, it's middle age, but it's like drinking hard and it's like not working out. And so it's aging really rapidly. And then Julius Caesar comes in, puts the civilization on a diet, cuts out the alcohol, gets it exercising. And so Roman civilization then carries on for, 400 or 500 years after that, but never regains its youth, right? Never regains that vitality that it had at its inception. And so similarly, like Western civilization is never going to reboot and become young again. But what it can do is stop driving itself into the ground so aggressively. And that almost always happens by the work of a singular leader. So it's essentially going to be an American Caesar is going to come along and cut out a lot of these things. Just look at French civilization. Like the French Revolution, people don't understand how communist it was. Like it was exactly communist. Every single army had commissars with it that ensured that everyone complied, that everyone was all about equality and didn't say anything that was counter to the revolution. And then Napoleon comes out and essentially, and the French nation was spiraling, right? Productivity was declining. The economy was tanking. Its military, after some initial, victories because of the mass mobilization of the population, was losing. It was poorly organized. And then Napoleon comes along and sets everything right and gives the French a great 19th century. So anyway, we're in the same thing. We're in a communist death spiral, and someone is going to come along with the power to cut all of that out and to stabilize the West. And that's going to happen eventually. But over the long run, over the next 200 or 300 years, I think our civilization is headed for the grave.
Do you feel like, again, I feel like I know the answer. Do you feel that masculinity is being suppressed? And how is that affecting society?
So, yes. And look, like most of the people who are actively suppressing masculinity will tell you as much, right? They might call it toxic masculinity, but then you ask them what's non-toxic masculinity, and they have no real answer. Nothing that corresponds to actually being
Sounds
male,
like they just
right?
hate men, honestly.
So they do. And many of them are open about that. And many of them have reasons for it. So yeah, obviously our civilization is hostile towards masculinity. Look, men, besides just being half the people and it being bad for that reason, also sort of represent the will of civilization. men are romantics and idealists. People get this wrong all the time. They think of women as romantics and idealists, when in truth, men are much more so than women when it comes to how we live our lives. Like, I mean, just look at history. Look at the number of men who are willing to die for a cause versus women. Part of that is also like biologically programmed, right? Men are not precious. Women are precious, biologically speaking, because a single man can impregnate a lot of women, whatever. So anyway, like, it's masculinity that builds a railroad across the United States. It's masculinity that puts a man on the moon. It's a masculinity that builds the Brooklyn Bridge or the Golden Gate Bridge, right? It's masculinity that does, that gives us the Iliad and the Odyssey. Like, masculinity is totally this double-edged sword. There's this good quote by, what's her name? Camille Paglia. And she says, there's no female Mozart for the same reason there's no female Jack the Ripper, which is to say that art is an inherently violent act. You took a look at the world and you said, I don't like the way that it's organized or arranged. I'm going to reorganize it and rearrange it into what I think is ideal. And so it is assertive. You're imposing on the natural world anytime you create art. And so I think people don't think of it in those terms. I think people generally think of a less masculine world as a less violent world, which is true, and that's how it's often justified. But I think it's also a less far-reaching world, technologically, artistically, and in a number of other pursuits.
I'm pretty lucky. Jiu-Jitsu, of course, Brazilian culture is very much like, it's not very woke as it is. It resists that type of culture, and Jiu-Jitsu hasn't really fallen into that wokeness over the last couple of years. That's been kind of it's been kind of like a safe haven for me in a time when I feel like, am I going crazy, or is everyone around me like pushing these views on me? Honestly, a lot of the ways that the hyper progressive people push views is kind of the exact same criticism that they have about religious folks, which is they're pushing their views on people, and that's why they don't like it. And I'm thinking, like, but it's almost like you're religious in a different way. You know, if it's not about anti-racism or equality, it's about feminism, or it's about LGBTQ, or it's about COVID. Even like a lot of these opinions for people are like religions. If you go against them, it's almost like it causes them physical pain, because you try to have opinions with some of these, try to have conversations with some of these people, and a lot of times they don't really have arguments. They're just fueled by emotions. And even if you were to ask, try to have a conversation with a progressive person about like Trump versus Biden, let's say, and Trump is, and again, I honestly, I think they're both, I have criticisms of both, but I'll just say right now, if I had my choice, I'd probably pick Trump because I agreed with a lot of his policies compared to Biden's policies. And then I ask some people about, oh, okay, you don't like Trump. Why? Oh, he's a racist. Why is he a racist? Oh, because about what he said about Mexicans. I'm like, but what about his policies? Like, what about the First Step Act? What about the idea of a country having a border? Like, do you believe in that? Well, yeah, I mean, we should have a border. I'm like, so tell me what you don't like about the policies. And then that's when the conversation usually ends, right? That's when they check out and they leave the room, and it's like, oh, well, that didn't go anywhere, right? So it's interesting to me how there seems to be, especially since Trump got elected years and years ago, we can't even extend the olive branch across the aisle, right? We can't even have a discussion with the other side. There used to be shows and conversations between people who are conservative and people who are liberal, and it was kind of just agree to disagree situation. But now it's like, if you disagree with this, you're a racist. If you disagree with this, you're not allowed to come to the Thanksgiving table. If you disagree with this, you are you are a racist, whatever or on the other side, you are a whatever, a libtard or whatever you want to call it. And I think what we really need is to be able to get back and to be able to appreciate each other's views, and to also just like, to get away from this thing where we're judging people so hard that we don't want anything to do with our best friends anymore because of who they vote for. We don't want anything to do with our family members anymore because they don't want to get a vaccine. Is there a way we can get back into that, do you think?
Yes, but you're not going to like it because
I might.
Look, you might actually. But look, essentially, it's only right-wing people who have been excluded from polite society for their beliefs, right? You can be a communist, you can be as far left as you want to be, you can be ultra woke, and you're not excluded from society. And you're not excluded from positions, you're not excluded from any jobs.
You might even get a promotion.
You might even get a promotion, right? Like you look at some of these, like I think one of the Weather Underground terrorists from the 1970s who like literally planted bombs that killed people are now professors at Columbia University, right? And so what you need is just a total inversion of that, which is like just you look at it from a combat sports perspective. If you've been getting beat up for 5 minutes, you don't then say like, all right, truce. Like that's just never going to happen. Like, hey, what if we all just chill? You start punching back, and that's the point at which everyone kind of be like, oh, that hurt when you hit me. Yeah, that hurt when you hit me. Okay, maybe we shouldn't do this anymore. And so essentially what you need is for people who are not woke, when they come into power, you need to treat being woke like you would treat being a Nazi, which is to say, if you were woke, you can get forgiveness, but you don't get anywhere near power ever. If you were at any point in the past woke, sorry, that's just closed to you, right? So you're all removed from positions of power. You get no funding. You can't be a professor. You can't get a job in the professions. It's completely disqualifying in terms of running for office. It's not viable. You might be prosecuted like that. And you do that for 10 or 20 years. And then we can all kind of sit down to the table and say, okay, let's come to a compromise here. And you can kind of reestablish freedom of expression and things like that. But if you want to like a game plan of how this used to work and what it looks like to defeat, I mean, let's be real. Wokeism is just race communism. Like it is contiguous with communism. It is communism. And if you want to like a game plan for how to beat it, you can go look at the first kind of red wave of communism in the United States, which really happened leading up to World War One. And you had the IWW, which was a union, but an openly communist union with connections to the Soviet Union and all of that. And it was like successfully beaten back here in the United States. And if you go and study how that was done, it wasn't through like argument and persuading people. It was through police action and like real repression of people who were involved in those kinds of organizations. And so if you want to, I've been reading more about that. There's this really great Substack called Conundrum Cluster. If people are interested in that, I recommend going and reading that. But I would just say, like, again, when it comes to all this stuff, most people, I mean, look, like the hyper woke are not like your average Democratic voter even, right? The really woke people are like 5% of this country, maybe 10. And there's no arguing with those people. Like they just have to be completely removed and excluded from power and not allowed to go anywhere near it again. That's the only way this ends.
And I think as the dollar gets less valuable and as people make less money and have the ability to support things less, don't you think that communism has more of a better environment to grow and to thrive as people get poorer and poorer? because they'll start to look to the
Well,
state
sort of.
for sustenance.
Kind of. And yet at the same time, like, yes, we are in the perfect environment where, people are kind of more economically desperate. And yet there is still this infinite ability to print dollars to fund all of this stuff. And so if at any point the system actually breaks, then at that point, the capacity to sustain all these government benefits goes away. And so does the ideology.
And you're absolutely right about, like, you could be openly very communist and, get promotions and whatnot. I was at the pool with my kid the other day, and I saw a dude, American History X style, had a hammer and sickle tattooed right across his chest. And I was like, man, you got that tattoo, but I bet, like, you're absolutely anti-Nazi, right? It's like, do you know your history? Do you know the actual the numbers? Do you know about the Soviet Union and the things that they were capable of doing? You might as well have a swastika on your chest. That would not fly. Like, that person would be kicked out of the pool instantly. But because it's or he could have a tattoo of Shay on his chest, and people would be like, oh, that's cool. Mike Tyson's got a tattoo of Shay on his body. And these communist figures are kind of like accepted. It's just interesting. Maybe it's because the winners write the history, right? And so we think Nazi. And now these people are calling anyone who disagrees with them a Nazi, right? But it's like, man, what about the Soviet Union? What about the atrocities that they committed? What about the Holodomor, right? What about the decades of oppression that they put their own people through? And it's funny how certain genocides and certain oppressive groups get really, really shown over history as negative, and then others are kind of even revered.
Yeah. Always look, as humans, and this is proper and right, we have only a certain capacity to care about certain things. So, for example, in Armenia or in Azerbaijan, a bunch of Armenians who've lived in this city for hundreds, maybe thousands of years, were all ethnically cleansed earlier this year. And they all had to move. They packed up in trucks and they moved to Armenia because the Azerbaijanis are just like, I actually don't fully understand the conflict, why they had a problem with the Armenians continuing to live there. They got completely ethnically cleansed. No one cared. And you can complain about this, but it's actually like completely normal and healthy for, like, what are you going to do? Care equally about every conflict in the world? Like, do I need to show you a list of every conflict and like tell you how many people are killed so that you can adjust your emotional meter accordingly? Like, no. You're going to care about people who you have a history with, who who might have a bearing on yourself if you think that conflict might have like resonance. For example, like if you see something in a European country that are pretty similar to ours, you think, oh, that's something that maybe might happen in the United States. You're going to have a certain affinity with people who look like you. Like, of course, you're going to care about conflicts differently. And so I think if you wanted to see a defeat of wokeism, it's not enough to say we're going to equally weight the Holodomor and the Holocaust. You have to be willing to say, we're not going to like say the Holocaust is okay all of a sudden, but you have to be willing to say, actually, we're going to replace in the top spot as kind of the most evil actions that people have taken. We're going to do the Cultural Revolution and the Holodomor and the killing fields in Southeast Asia, in Cambodia. I don't know why that took me so long to remember. And just you have to replace that like top spot of like the most evil example we have with communism. That's what you have to do if you want to see it rooted out.
You almost have to mock it, and you have to like point it out now. Like, don't wait. Like you said, don't wait until there's a genocide. Like, it has to be now when it's there's a risk. I understand some people can't speak out about this because their job is on the line and they might be working for a company that's very subscribed to like wokeness. But that's why I work for myself. But a lot of people aren't in that.
Yeah.
They're not in that position.
Well, I think part of it too, though, to be honest, though, you can't really engineer it. Like, the truth of the matter is, I know people who have relatives who were in the Holocaust, right? I have Jewish friends who had like a grandparent who was in a concentration camp, or a great uncle or something like that, right? And because so many Jews moved to the United States from Europe after World War II, and because there's just such a connection between European and American Jewry because of Ellis Island and all that. Whereas I don't know that I know anyone who had a family member in the Holodomor, right? There's just not that like same connection to Ukrainians or Russian people. And so part of it is like, I don't know that you can really like engineer. You can't make people care, right? Part of it is just a natural outgrowth of who we know. And so the Holocaust has more resonance with us. And unfortunately, until there is like something so in your face evil that comes from the left somehow, like people just aren't going to recognize it as the threat that it is, I guess.
Makes sense. I'm not going to take much more of your time. I just have a couple quick questions for you, and just they can be quick answers. What makes a person great?
Fortune. So there are a lot of people in this world who have amazing talents and abilities. But what you have from time to time is just a meeting of a certain specimen of a person with a certain set of talents and this great need for exactly that type of person. And when those two come together, that is what creates greatness, right? Yes, you need talent, you need energy, you need focus. But if you want to be truly great, you have to be fortunate enough to come at a time that needs exactly who you are in that moment.
Very interesting. I don't know if it's Napoleon. Who's your favorite historical figure?
My favorite historical figure is Joseph Smith. He's the founder of Mormonism, born in the early 1800s in upstate New York, founded this incredible movement, translated the Book of Mormon, and then was a great city builder, built a city in Ohio and Missouri, and then built this beautiful city on the banks of the Mississippi in Illinois. Incredibly interesting thinker, and brought to the surface some ideas that were just hundreds of years ahead of their time. You can think that was from God, as I do. I think if you don't think that it were, you have to confront his genius is what it would have to be. So that's probably my favorite.
You did a show on him?
I did a show on Brigham Young, who was a successor, in part because Brigham Young has more kind of secular achievements that are easier to understand just from a historical context without getting into the religion. That's why I did Brigham Young. I haven't done one on Joseph Smith.
Ben Wilson, you could have dinner or interview any person in history. Who would it be? And what would you ask them?
Well, I think I would have dinner with Alexander the Great. And what would I ask him? I mean, you have some real conspiracies from Alexander's time of like, who really killed his father? Was that an assassination plot? Was he involved in it? Which, if you get him to be honest, would be really interesting. But more, it's less about the questions I would ask and more about just having a conversation with him and understanding, like, what does that kind of charisma look like? Like someone who is just able to capture the hearts and minds of the most badass warriors in the world, and they just followed him blindly and just loved him. Like, what kind of person are you? That's why I would want to have dinner with him more than any specific questions.
I'm surprised, and I'm curious as to why haven't you done an episode on Adolf Hitler? And is one in the works? Is that something that you're planning on doing, or have you been putting that off for a while? Because obviously Hitler is like, I don't know if influential is the word, but
incredibly influential.
Like our society,
but,
so much of our culture and our society is built on the fact that we beat the Nazis, right? And it just seems to me, as a podcast that covers historical figures, that Hitler would be inevitable as one of the topics.
Yeah, and it will be. I'll do an episode on Hitler. I don't know. Honestly, I just haven't gotten around to him. There's no like great reason to not do Hitler. People are like, "Oh, so controversial." It's actually not controversial. Like, I don't know. At least I don't have a controversial take on Hitler. I'm not like pro Hitler. And actually, people are more than willing to like recognize that yes, he was a great man with some very obviously interesting attributes, and that doesn't mean that he didn't do totally evil things, right? Like, it's actually people are like, "Oh, can you say that?" I'm like, yeah, you can say that. People know that. Like, of course, he had to have been incredibly persuasive and a great communicator, which he was. I guess more of it is, yeah, of course, there's some awkwardness in like How to Take Over the World is supposed to be learning lessons, and like learning lessons from Hitler feels weird. So maybe that's the reason.
Maybe to the people who are super woke, they just hear Hitler and then you saying, okay, here's some positive, characteristics about Hitler that made him a great leader. Oh my God, you love Hitler? What are you? Ben Wilson loves Hitler. It's like, no, I'm saying a man who's able to take a country who's in, just coming off a huge depression and then bring it into a superpower in the world again. Like, yeah, that is undeniably impressive. And not saying what he did is like good or he's good.
People are always interested in outliers, right? Whether that's Hitler, whether that's Stalin, whether it's like Jeffrey Dahmer. I mean, look at how many true crime, podcasts and shows there are out there. Like, people love learning about outliers. And I think people can grasp, unless like, yeah, of course, there's like that 5% of the population that you just can't worry about because they're going to be offended by anything. But yeah, most people understand very easily that people can be very interesting and compelling without being admirable.
Last question I'll ask you. What's your biggest fear?
Well, honestly, my biggest fear is like not is not that interesting. My biggest fear is something happening to my children. That's like, if you ask me what I actually have nightmares about, that's it. So that's not a very interesting fear. So I'll give you a more interesting answer, which is I just really don't want to. There's a quote. I don't want to get the attribution wrong. Who said it? Henry David Thoreau. Most men lead lives of quiet desperation. And that's just not how I want to die, having lived a life of quiet desperation and then it ends.
I just did a podcast yesterday with one of my buddies and I asked him the same question. I said, what's your biggest fear? And he said, basically he fears, going through life and leaving something on the table, right? The fear of like regret. And I'm the same way, except I've always looked at it as a fear of time. I've always said I have a fear of time because I don't want time. First of all, you can't slow down time, which I find kind of terrifying, right? Because I like to accomplish things right when I wake up. I wake up and I think like, okay, how can I improve what I'm doing in my life? A lot of the time it's Jiu Jitsu or podcast or, being with my kids or whatever. And the idea of time going by and regretting leaving something on the field, to me, really terrifies me. And that, to not reach your full potential, I think that's a huge fear of mine. Or maybe I didn't reach my full potential, but I didn't even try. Like that to me, when I'm, if I get to 70, 80, 90 years old, I'm an old man, and I look back and I thought, man, I should have done that. I could have done more. I should have tried harder. I should have taken that jump. That, to me, that's what I fear. You know, I don't want to leave anything on the field. I want to make sure that when I'm 90 years old, I can look back and say, I fucking did it. I tried my best, even if I didn't succeed. Like, I put it all out there.
Yeah, I actually think that there are no shortage of, honestly, people who are willing to just like be inoffensive and go out through life. And like, what the world is in danger of is not enough people who will not do bad things. What the world is in danger of right now is people who don't accomplish the thing that they were meant to do in life, right? So I 100% would echo exactly what you said, which is like, go for it. You know, so I did an interview. Mr. Beast, Jimmy Donaldson, is a fan of the podcast How to Take Over the World, reached out. So I went and did an interview with him. And he said, I decided when I was a teenager that like either I was going to make it as a very wealthy YouTuber, or I was just going to die at 90 years old, whatever, just doing YouTube my entire life and just failing. Like, that's it. I just made the decision. This is the thing I'm doing. Either I'll just fail at it my entire life, or somehow I'll find a way to succeed. And now look at how successful he is. And so I hope everyone is able to find something like that in their own life, which is just like either succeed or die trying. Like, really, a man's reach should exceed his grasp. Really go for it. And if you don't make it, then that's fine. Flame out, die a wreck in the gutter, rather than just going through your life never trying.
My favorite Mr. Beast video is the one where he says Logan Paul 500,000 times, and it's like 18 hours long. He's just Logan Paul, yeah. Logan Paul, Logan Paul. Like, oh my God, dude.
And by the end, he's like, ugh, ugh, ugh.
That's so great. Dude, I've taken enough of your time. Listen, guys, if you guys are listening, How to Take Over the World, easily my favorite history podcast, if not my favorite podcast to listen to. I'm addicted to it. I really recommend you guys check out How to Take Over the World with Ben Wilson. Ben, can you let us know how to reach you, how to find you, any products that you want to talk about?
No, yeah, just go listen to the podcast, How to Take Over the World, on all major platforms. And if you want to learn more, you can go to takeoverpod.com.
Thank you so much for coming today. I really appreciate your time, Ben. It was a great chat. Thank you so much.
I appreciate it.
Hey guys, if you want to support the show, check out the links in the bottom. I got my kids' book there. You can buy that. You can check out the online store if you want to buy some merchandise. Other than that, take care of you guys. Remember, the Essential Jiu Jitsu podcast is everything you need to know about Jiu Jitsu. Thank you very much.